The other one, which isn't shown here, is Pinterest. That's now starting to show strong growth as well. And of course, LinkedIn is a really important element for professionals, and particularly amongst people recruiting people as well. And companies using things like LinkedIn for press releases and to do some marketing to business professionals. So of course you need to mention Facebook with 2.2 million users. It is the dominant social media platform. But like with anything that big with such a high percentage, it's starting to plateau. You'd argue Facebook's pretty mainstream. Almost, majority of New Zealanders have used it. So we're starting to see that come to a point where it's plateauing in growth, which is not because people are not as interested in it, it's just because when something becomes that big, you're not going to continue to see the same growth figures as you will in some of the other smaller platforms. But then Facebook is actually itself facing a bit of a battle recently. I certainly know that's the case in Australia from other platforms, and obviously needs to look at ways to reinvent itself and engage with consumers. So the next area is Twitter. So I've just said just before that this is something that's starting to grow now. So you're now seeing 7.5% of New Zealanders have visited Twitter in the last 4 weeks. But Twitter is really the domain of younger people. As you can see, 30% of users are aged 18 to 24 years. This is the LinkedIn piece, so this is social media for professionals. And I know our company, for example, has used it quite extensively for recruitment purposes. And it's amazing the amount of invitations you get from recruitment agencies on LinkedIn, but also just as your ability to do things like if you're doing cold calling, you can actually get to see who's running certain positions in certain organisations, and you can drop them a line. So it's really good for obviously doing sales calls and sales leads. But even more so, like I said before, this whole idea of companies using it as their own podium to talk about great things that they're doing, and using it as a PR channel increasingly as well. As well as I think also notable people that you can follow, e.g. like Barack Obama and Richard Branson and so forth. So it's not, this is, I think with YouTube, it's saying that it's not just things like publishers or word of mouth, it's also television has to some degree challenges from this new sort of social media world, and YouTube is certainly one of them. It's one of many to do with video streaming or sharing of videos. I think the really interesting thing about YouTube is the people, and you'll notice down the bottom, 9% of people who who've used YouTube don't watch commercial television, and there is an increasing number, particularly amongst younger males, 14 to 24-year-old males, who are increasingly turning to sites like YouTube or video sharing and or video streaming sites, and fundamentally not watching any commercial television anymore. And it's interesting that some of the groups, particularly like 14 to 24-year-old males, and I know as a research company, they are about the hardest group you're ever going to get to find. And I've been told mums say the same thing. But they're really, really difficult to communicate with and to incentivise and to talk to. And so understanding where they're gravitating to is really important. But this is sort of, we are seeing this trend in Australia as well, that more of these sites are attracting people away from traditional media like television, despite the fact I will say television still reigns as king. We're just going to have a little look at some media trends. So I think the interesting context here is everyone has sort of said over the last decade there's been fragmentation of media and the internet's killing traditional media. And the fragmentation that I like, what I have in my mind is really, if you look at what was available in media 10 years ago and what is available here, you've got many more opportunities to watch different televisions, or there are many more different titles, there are many more different websites, there's just many more of media, so media is not quite as homogenous as it was 10 years ago. The other point is, it's a really interesting thing as a research company. Often we say, well, how much time do you spend with TV, how much time do you spend with radio, how much time do you spend with print, how much time do you spend on the internet? And people think of it as one or the other, and it's not. If you actually think about it, and we've broken this down, and you have a look at, everyone's spending more time online, and they're spending less time with traditional things like television and radio. The irony is, if that's the word, is if you have a look at the online number that's growing, most of it, the majority of that, is actually things like reading a newspaper, reading a magazine, watching TV, listening to the radio. So it isn't really an either or. The internet is actually complementing that traditional media and allowing people just many more ways to consume it. I don't know off the top of my head what the exact number is for New Zealand, but I suspect it will be under a half of that activity will be things, or under a half of that time will be around things like researching and searching, but the majority of the time will be around consuming fairly traditional forms of media, watching a movie, watching a TV show, like I said, reading a book, reading a magazine. It's still where we spend a lot of time, but we now tend to do it online. So a lot of this isn't at the expense of traditional media, it's really more about how traditional media embraces the internet. And I think publishers have done a tremendous job of that. And I think we've seen both here and in Australia that people have forecasted the doom and gloom around things like newspapers, particularly, and magazines. But we're seeing in Australia the highest total masthead readers that we've seen in 10 years. And here we're seeing clearly at least stabilisation of readership numbers in the press. And that's really been because of the digital universe and online, where people are really now starting to consume newspapers and magazines online rather than in hard copy. So it's not something that's necessarily going to be a curse in some respects, it actually is enhancing. So 42% of New Zealanders have visited a news or a newspaper site. And I think you'll see in the next few examples, the basic theory is that the internet has, again in media, as a form of amplification. If you're a news junkie, then really what the internet's done is it's just given you many more ways to indulge your love of news. And whether or not that's radio or TV or whatever it is, the internet just gives you more ability to be able to get more of it whenever you want it. It hasn't taken it away. There is a form of fragmentation in terms of there's different, rather than having one spot and one source for something, you may have 10, but the cumulative effect is that people are actually, who like something, are now doing more of it than they did before. And I think the smartphone's particularly important here because, again, it becomes a really easy way when you're sitting somewhere or on the train or on the bus or at home or in bed. It just gives you much more flexible ways to quickly check the newspaper, or quickly read something, or even catch up, have some catch-up television. This is really interesting. So the New Zealand Herald readership has reached 1.2 million. So as I said before, anyone who thought they would see the demise of newspapers and magazines, this certainly hasn't been the case. So we're seeing, like I said before, fairly steady readership numbers because of what's happened online. You'll see here, as an example of just the average metropolitan daily, you'll start to see the shift that's occurring. And this is fairly predictable just in terms of the amount of people who are reading print only versus digital only versus a combination of both print and digital. So what you're finding is that this stabilisation of print numbers, and in some respects increase in print numbers, is actually coming from the digital area. So you'll see here that you're getting something like an over 200% increase in the amount of digital-only readers of average metropolitan Monday to Friday dailies. I think the real challenge here, and I think most of you would know this in the room, is really the challenge around the commercialisation of that digital offering. I know that I started reading a hell of a lot more newspaper on an app until they decided to actually bring in a fee for doing so, and then I deleted it. So it's it is that area of the paywall and how you manage that is still going to be a challenge for some of the publishers. Radio listening, so as I said before, what you're finding now are people who love listening to radio will now actually listen to more radio. We're finding again this amplification, the fact that you can now stream radio on your smartphone or wherever it is. A lot of people will do it at work, I'm not sure if they're allowed to, but have their headphones in and they'll be listening to the radio. So again, it's provided just many more avenues for people to be able to indulge their love of certain media, and radio is certainly one really good example. This is very interesting too. So there's 500,000 people streaming TV online. And I've often thought to myself, it's one of those, I think anything to do with the digital universe and television is like one of those holy grails. I think Apple certainly has had one big go at it with the whole Apple TV concept of the convergence of the TV set in the lounge room and having the internet somehow connected to it, and then being able to watch TV and access all your media, etc., etc. But it's still fairly problematic. So I also think the other interesting thing here is, of course, is what does television mean anymore? And again, may I just say, as a research company, we often debate this because it was really easy years ago. You just say, did you watch any TV or commercial TV or whatever the question might be. And that was pretty straightforward. We meant the TV set. You watch TV on a TV. You watch TV. That was the only way you could watch TV. Now when you say you watch TV, it's like, geez, do we mean you watch TV on the smartphone? Now, is that TV? Is that TV? Is that streamed? Is it and you actually get to the stage where you can go a little bit spare, realising there are so many possibilities of watching TV. What is TV? And is it the set? Is it commercial? Is it catch-up? Etc., etc. So it's a really dynamic area, and it's a really interesting area. The other thing, I'm not sure if this happens here, but I know the Foxtel, which is the predominant pay TV supplier in Australia, has a service via Xbox 360. I use that myself. So, you know, this whole idea that you can use your game consoles connected to your TV, and you can basically look at pay TV, live TV, as well as stuff that you've stored and recorded earlier, is just a really important and growing area. And of course, we've got the new Xbox One coming out. Well, I think I'm not sure if you're later this year or early next year, but that's certainly a device very much aimed at this market, which has an HDMI input in, so it becomes part of your entire sort of television viewing, live television viewing ecosystem. Because I think Microsoft have realised for these things to be the hub, it needs to connect to the concept of live television directly. So, and I think that still has been just a bit of a technical challenge. But like I said, we're still seeing 500,000 people streaming TV online. The 8% accessing the internet, that's really more about actually browsing. And I think that, and any of you who've ever tried it, it's a fairly painful experience. So really at the moment, if you think about it, a lot of smart TVs these days are actually connected to the internet just 100% of the time, as well as these devices like PlayStations as well. But this is really about people actually actively, you know, doing emails and browsing on their television set, which can often be a bit of a strain on the eye and how you input on the keyboard. This one's really interesting in terms of the challenge of advertising on the internet. So 32% notice advertising while surfing the internet. I had a little bit of discussion about this earlier. I think the whole thing, a lot of our clients struggle with what is the return on digital advertising. How do you measure digital advertising? It's certainly very cheap. It's something that people can do in-house. But in some industries, we have noticed that there has been a certain backlash because there's been a lot of hype, and some of the reality around it is questionable. So I think there is a lot of work to go in that area. I know this programmatic buying is really taking off, which will go some way towards addressing this. I also think things like the demise of the cookie pull. I think I just saw yesterday, and I might be making this up, but I think it was Google. I'm pretty sure it was Google. It was talking about the world post cookies. We know that cookies are not going to be really around for much longer. So people today are struggling to get cookie pulls and sell audiences in real time on the internet to target new car buyers, or whether or not it's overseas trips. But that's going to become increasingly difficult as that shuts down, and people are now, I think, the next big thing in terms of targeted advertising and understanding who is the person behind that browser or that device, because that's the hardest thing. How do I know who that person is? So therefore, what do I advertise to them? I think the big thing is going to be about how you have a digital fingerprint on devices. So forget cookies, how do you understand that my Samsung phone is me? And how can I imprint upon that a digital fingerprint? There's a lot of companies patenting and working on that at the moment. And I think that's actually really the next challenge after I think the demise of the cookie in the next couple of years, particularly around privacy around those areas. Looking at banking, so just moving across to banking. This has probably been the one industry to me that's it's been a great example of embracing the digital universe has been banking. perhaps that's cynically because banks see the digital universe as a way of lowering their cost to serve, being more profitable because they can basically get rid of branches and move everyone online where it costs them a whole lot less. But that's probably a little bit cynical. At the same time, actually consumers have voted with their fingers to go online to do their banking because it is easy, because most people don't want to go into a branch, most people don't want to have a lot of contact with their banks, they just want to be able to access their money, move their money around, pay bills. So it's certainly been an area that very early on has really adopted the whole digital universe and online very quickly. There's a slide that we have which shows that there was a little period of time where phone banking took off, and as soon as the internet came in terms of internet banking, that basically killed phone banking fairly quickly. And then ever since then, internet banking has grown enormously, whether or not it's on your PC or whether or not it's now via apps. The only thing, again, I mentioned, as I've said earlier, is that we also do have to remember in a financial services world, most people that have a lot of money and are financially quite sophisticated and do things like share trading and have investments, still do a lot of face-to-face contact. So it's not a world that can be moved completely online. There is still a need to have branches and advisors and phone centres, just due to the fact that there is such a range of different products and levels of sophistication in the marketplace. But it's certainly one where the majority of younger generations are now adopting internet banking or app banking as pretty well 100% of the way that they deal with banks and building societies. So 45% of New Zealanders went online to pay household bills. So you'd imagine out of everything, this would have to be the easiest thing to do. It's low involvement, it's convenient, and it's absolutely a perfect way of paying your bills. You don't have to worry about going to the post office, you don't have to worry about writing a cheque. You can just do all of this online and set it up as automatic billing. So this has been one area that's really taken off. The other thing I think is really interesting too is that millions of dollars that have gone into creating customer service experience in the banking sector. So this is all about making sure that problems can be resolved quicker. So after disasters, banks are out there with their electronic kits trying to get insurance claims resolved on the spot, and therefore using technology as a way to drive customer satisfaction. Digital universe has also allowed the banks themselves to become sort of broadcasters or publishers in their own right, and we often forget that banks can actually have as many visitors to their website as a publisher does, and the ANZ has almost as many visitors to its site as the New Zealand Herald. Obviously it's a very different site, but they command massive engagement and massive audiences of their own, which I think is just very interesting. And this has been something that has occurred as a result of the digital universe, and can also, of course, in the future change the way banks may in fact spend money on advertising. 462,000 New Zealanders use a smartphone for banking activities, so smartphones have been very important in the financial services area as well. So there's been a lot of app development in this area. I know of apps which are very successful, which are what they call compare me apps, where you can go in and you can say, I'm like this, so therefore how much money should I have? Or I'm like this, so therefore where should I invest? So there's a lot of work being done in terms of apps for engagement. And also, of course, a lot of that information gets sent back to the bank so that they can actually build up even more targeted profiles about the consumers and understand maybe their future intentions and plans. So a lot of money being spent on here across many different devices, across many different operating systems. And we're seeing very large growth figures in terms of mobile and app banking, particularly amongst higher income professionals. So the last area I'm just going to look at is online shopping. So I think it's interesting to say that most traditional bricks and mortar retailers have seen the digital universe more as a curse than a blessing. And most, I think, have been, as a general rule, slower to embrace the internet than perhaps they should have. I think that's, it's interesting when you have a look at what does the internet mean for those people, because the internet's actually